probabilities. Astronomically, extravagantly improbable things happen all the time by chance, and we don't seek alternative explanations. Consider a hand of 13 cards dealt in the game of bridge. It's not as many as the number of constants for making the world, which Dr. Craig pointed to, but the argument is exactly the same. If you got dealt a hand of all 13 cards which turned out to be in the same suit, say all spades, what would you think? Well, perhaps someone stacked the deck, because the odds against such an amazing fluke are actually one chance in 635,000 million. You'd stop the game and you'd write to column 8 and tell them what an amazing coincidence you had. But let's say you're dealt the usual, ordinary, boring hand of mixed up cards. You don't accuse the dealer of cheating and call the Sydney Morning Herald every time you're dealt a hand. But actually, each hand you are dealt is just as improbable, 635,000 million to 1. They're all equally improbable, and you have to get dealt one of them. It's just that we don't find most of them very interesting. So what? No matter how many cards or physical constants, the outcome has to be one of these. They're equally unlikely as this one that we happen to be in. So the mere unlikelihood of this arrangement is not on its own enough to conclude. On its own, it's not enough to conclude that it couldn't have been an accident. We might not have been here, of course, in those other worlds to remark on our good fortune. But that's like people who survive against great odds in the war. They're the ones who get to tell the story. It doesn't mean that their amazing luck was anything other than amazing luck. The famous Cornell astronomer Carl Sagan wrote an essay once about Norman Bloom, the messenger of God. When I was a graduate student, I used to see Norman Bloom hanging around the gates of Columbia University in New York, distributing his pamphlets in which he gave a novel proof of God, in this case from the telephone directory. I think it only worked for the Manhattan directory and not for Brooklyn. If you did, apparently, according to Norman Bloom, some calculations on the telephone numbers, you multiply the first by the second and divide it by the third, something like that, you get the number 1 or 0, I don't remember exactly, but something entirely unlikely and fantastic. And the question is, what were the odds against that? Well, Norman Bloom said it's 1,000,000,000 to 1. And he says it can't be an accident, perhaps the hand or the mind of God. And the poor fellow, he writes on his pamphlet that he's been offering all the famous professors at Columbia University, Harvard, Princeton, and everybody up and down the East Coast, $10,000 if they can prove him wrong. Well, nobody's taken up his offer, so he thinks he wins. I think we've heard that one before. One final remark on perfection. David Hume, the philosopher, pointed out, or he asked the question, how do we know that this world is so perfect anyway? What comparisons can we make with other worlds? Hume facetiously suggests that perhaps this is a botched-up attempt of a retired, superannuated deity in occupational therapy, or the efforts of an infant deity. These are his jokes, not mine. But as far as life is concerned, it was the late Stephen Jay Gould who pointed out that it's actually the imperfections of the world that are the best evidence, in this case, for evolution by natural selection rather than design. For example, why would an omnipotent God design horses' hooves, bat wings, and porpoise flippers, all with 5 fingers, like our hands? I mean, swimming with fleshy, webbed fingers seems to work all right, but if you were an omnipotent designer, you could come up with something better. If I were designing a porpoise, I'd give it a propeller. We're talking about omnipotence, after all. Dr. Craig also talked about the question of values and morality, and I'm quickly running out of time, and so not only on that issue, but also the question of Jesus and his historicity and what conclusions one can draw from that. I might come back to that more fully in my rebuttals and my second attempt to have a discussion, but let me just go back while I've got a couple of seconds to mention something relevant to that. I mentioned, and this is relevant to the question of the historicity of Jesus and how one goes about believing in these cases. I mentioned the Mexican god Quetzalcoatl. The Mexicans have their own sacred book in which are recorded fantastic stories about Quetzalcoatl, but of course you wouldn't believe any of their miracles for a moment. And you don't care how many Mexican Indians saw them with their own eyes. And of course their book is only 500 years old. As the philosopher David Hume pointed out, human testimony is pretty unreliable, especially when it comes to claims which contravene everything we know about the laws of nature. Or perhaps maybe Mexican Indians are less reliable than ancient Middle Easterners. And of course they tell me that if I don't accept Quetzalcoatl into my life, when I die, I'll never get to see the great enchilada in the sky for all eternity. That's pretty mean, and I share Galileo's view that it would be pretty perverse of God to have given us a rational, skeptical mind and then expect us not to use it. Thank you.
Well, now, our debaters have laid out their case. We now will have 2 periods where they speak for 12 minutes each, and then 8 minutes each, where they will engage in tough intellectual wrestling with each other, so that the unsupported assertions can be uncovered and dealt with. So these will go 12 minutes, 12 minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes without interruption. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Professor Slezak for his trenchant response to my opening arguments. I remain unconvinced, as you might expect. Let me explain why. I first said we need to ask, what is the evidence for atheism? And here Dr. Slezak says that the only evidence against God's existence is the absence of evidence for God's existence. Now, this admission is highly significant, because it means that he tacitly agrees that all of the traditional arguments for atheism, like the problem of evil or the incoherence of the concept of God, all of these arguments fail. The only argument for atheism is the absence of evidence for God. But the problem here is that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. To give an example, most cosmologists believe that the universe went through an era of inflationary expansion soon after the Big Bang. As yet, we have no positive evidence, however, for this era. But does that mean, therefore, that such an era did not exist? Well, obviously not. Or to give a more mundane example, we have no evidence that there is gold on the planet Pluto. But does that mean, therefore, that there is no gold on Pluto? Well, clearly not. So when, then, does the absence of evidence count as evidence that something does not exist? Well, theorists of knowledge agree that the lack of evidence for some entity X counts as positive evidence against X's existence only in the case that if X did exist, then we should expect to see more evidence of X's existence than what we do see. For example, the absence of evidence of a planet between Venus and the Earth is a pretty good reason to think that such a planet does not exist, because if it did exist, we should have all kinds of evidence for it. Now, apply that then in the case of God. The absence of evidence for God's existence counts as evidence against God's existence only in the case that if God did exist, then we should see more evidence of his existence than what we do, in fact, see. In practical terms, what that means is this. If God exists, should we expect to see more evidence of his being than the origin of the universe out of nothing, the exquisite fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the apprehension of a realm of moral and aesthetic values, the radical claims and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead, and the immediate experience of personal fellowship with God? Well, I think the answer is obviously not. So to carry his argument, Dr. Slezak has to prove that it is highly probable that if God exists, we should have more evidence of his existence than what we do in fact have. And that, I think, is sheer speculation. And thus, in the case of God, I do not think that the absence of evidence is at all a positive argument against the existence of God, and yet that's all he's had to offer you tonight on behalf of atheism. So I don't think we've seen any good reason to think that atheism is true. Now, what about that second question? What is the evidence that God does exist? Here I offered 5 lines of evidence. First, the origin of the universe. Notice that Dr. Slezak responds to this argument by agreeing